And I think there isn't much space for people who are neurodivergent to actually be given time to articulate what they're trying to say. I think
Hi, everyone. Welcome back again to another season of QUEERxBodies. So today, on our first episode, we are joined by the amazing Shane.
Hi, I'm Shane. I am an independent queer activist in Bangkok, based in Bangkok. And I am a transgender man. I am 26, going on 27, and I use he, him pronouns.
Thank you so much, Shane. So Shane is an incredible activist, and there's so much we can learn from him. So Shane, do you think you could introduce kind of your experience advocating for the transgender community, particularly the community of trans men?
Absolutely. I think a lot of the times when we talk about trans activism, uh, a lot of identities are often left out, and especially in Bangkok and Thailand, I think there's a lot of focus on trans women, and there's trans women get more visibility than other trans identities, such as like non-binary trans identities, and it's very difficult for their voices to be heard. So my experience with advocating for other trans folks is that sometimes we need to talk about identities that are often not talked about or often left behind. Intersex identities are one of those, and trans non-binary identities are one of those.
Totally agree that we really need to do better work in distributing our emphasis so that we really, hear their stories and their voices too. And that's really important. So for those of you who don't know, Shane is an incredible activist in the education space as well, having founded an initiative of your own. So I was hoping you could talk about SEEN and the work that you've done there as well.
Absolutely. SEEN basically stands for Student Empowerment Equality Network, and SEEN is a network of multiple students from different schools, and mostly international schools that have come together and are trying to make the educational environment as inclusive and diverse as possible. Some of the initiatives that we've tried to implement in schools is trying to advocate for not like unisex uniforms and non-gendered uniforms. Another thing that we've tried to advocate for is instead of using mom and dad, we use adults at home, just change in language. But also, we're trying to push for change in curriculum and change in policies in schools to help queer and students from marginalized communities, whether they're communities like disabilities, neurodivergence, queer, race, things like that.
That is fantastic. And I really agree with you that these subtle changes in language can have such a profound impact on the way students, in their most critical time period of their life in school, right? It gets influenced so much, and those subtle changes can really go a long way. And, speaking of intersectional experiences, you've already mentioned some of them, like, being a person of color and neurodivergence. Hopefully we can hear about your experience with those intersections too. So do you think you could speak a bit about how you found the transgender or LGBTQ kind of advocacy experience as a person of color as well?
Queer advocacy and LGBTIQ advocacy is so focused on white gay men, white gay cis men especially.
Absolutely.
And I think that it is really, really important for us to kind of start looking at the struggles that other people, like people from other races or people from other backgrounds, face in the queer community or in the LGBTIQ community, because the experiences of someone who's a white queer person is going to be so much different from that of a person of color or a BAME person. And I think that's so important to highlight. Um, Personally, my experience is that uh, voices of people of color are often not heard enough or not highlighted enough, whether it's in the media or whether it's elsewhere. There's also certain things like certain fears that people of color might have, that, you know, people who are more privileged might not have. Things like police brutality, things like being discriminated in the workplace, being discriminated elsewhere. Um, and it just makes it really difficult for you to advocate for things when you're not being heard.
And so the other part of your identity that we're hoping to hear more about is, I also know you identify as neurodivergent. And
Mhm.
if you could speak about some of those intersectional experiences with being queer, and also how other activists can learn to include that into their narrative of activism and advocacy as well.
Absolutely. I think people who are neurodivergent definitely do struggle when it comes to advocacy and online activism, especially online and in person also. Um, you know, sometimes, like, for example, I have ADHD, and sometimes I struggle with articulating my points forward of what I'm actually trying to say, and sometimes I struggle with getting the right word and saying the right word. And I think there isn't much space for people who are neurodivergent to actually be given time to articulate what they're trying to say. I think a lot of a lot of uh, spaces are very biased to neurotypical people. Um, so for example, um, there are certain struggles that is so specific to queer neurodivergent people. So it's already difficult enough for example, trans people to find employment. It's going to make it more difficult if they choose to explain their neurodivergent status to their employers. That just creates this more of a struggle for queer neurodivergent people to find employment, as opposed to a gay a gay man who's neurotypical.
Yeah, totally. Thank you so much again for sharing some of those perspectives, especially about how online spaces can, either support or even worsen the experience of neurodivergent people. As a parting word, I was hoping you could leave some advice for other activists as well, and people who are hoping to pave the way for their own communities and intersectional identities like you have.
Absolutely. I think one of the things that I've learned recently in my experiences with online advocacy is that I've started giving more space to trans and non-binary voices. And the way that I've started doing that is, on every post, I will start putting a comment thread under my post for cis voices, but all the other comments are reserved for trans and non-binary, intersex, and POC voices. And I think that is so important to highlight, that people of color and trans voices are actually um, given more priority than cis voices, because of just basic equity. And I think that is so important. And I think a lot of queer activists need to start doing that too. Another thing that I actively try to do is, I don't try to speak for communities that I don't really understand. um, so I will try my best to give that platform to someone who is actually from that community. And I think that is so important, um, because I cannot speak for everyone. Share your own experience, and do it to the best of your capabilities, and yeah, you will definitely get your voice heard.